Ladies and gentlemen, I think we will make a start. Chatham House has been gathering internal and external expertise to examine the effects of, the coronavirus's impact on the Eurasian region. And today we're going to concentrate on Central Asia, of course. To do this and to reach a larger audience, not least an audience in the region itself, in Central Asia itself, we've linked up with the invaluable Institute for War and Peace Reporting. I suspect you all know the IWPR, its incredible work in supporting civil society and conflict-afflicted regions. And I'll leave my co-chair today, Abakan Sultanazarov, the IWPR's regional director for Central Asia, to say a few words in just a second. Before I do that, some boring admin and scheduling points, if I may. I'm sorry, I know you're probably quite familiar with this after 3 months or so of lockdown, but and innumerable Zoom calls, but I must just get through this as quickly as I can. Please bear with me before we get on to the interesting stuff. We've chosen this meeting format because we like it. It's a good thing where we can see everybody. So if you can turn on your cameras, that's wonderful. Make it as normal as possible these days. You are, however, having said that, muted, and we don't trust you that much, for the duration of the speakers' presentations. But when it comes to questions and discussion, we will unmute you. The speakers will present up to 7 minutes each. I'll introduce them in a second, and then we'll have Q&A as normal. To do Q&A, you probably know this by now. You can either type it into the chat room, either to me personally if you want to be anonymous, or broadly if you want everybody to see it, or you can raise your electronic hand in the participants tab at the bottom of your screens. On technical stuff, my colleague Quinton Scribner, you can probably see him, he's waving right there. He's on hand if you've got any questions. If you've got any questions, you can select his name in the participants tab again, and you can write to him if you need something. Finally, obviously, it's slightly difficult to do these events very much under the Chatham House rules. So we're on the record today, since there's 140 or so of us online. Now, more interestingly, 4 terrific speakers today, 2 from the region, 2 externals, if you like. Marlène Laroelle, I'm sure is known to you all. She's the director of European, Russian and Eurasia Studies Center at the Elliott School of International Studies at George Washington University. Marlène will talk about the immediate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the region's development, with a particular focus on the economy. And I would highly recommend Marlène's and Madeleine McCann, I think it was, Ponar's Eurasia piece on FSU responses more broadly. It's still a very relevant piece. Secondly, Erika Marat is Associate Professor at the College of International Security Affairs at the National Defense University, and Erika will speak about the immediate domestic and politics and security issues in Central Asia. Erika joins us from Washington and is therefore possibly just a little sleepy this morning. Bear with her. Sherbek Jurayev is the director of Crossroads at Central Asia. Sherbek will look at the medium-term impact in the region with a focus on 3 themes, particularly debt, dependence, and democracy. And last but not least, Iskander Aklibayev, director of the Kazakhstan Council on International Relations, will talk about the foreign policy dimension, including efforts to project soft power within the region. So that will take us about half an hour, maybe just over, and then we'll devote the remaining time to discussion, as I say. In the meantime, I'd like to welcome and reintroduce my co-chair, Abakan Sultanazarov, just to say a couple of things before we start off. Abakan, over to you. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, James. Dear experts, dear doctors, experts, analysts, ladies and gentlemen. Let me also welcome you all to our online discussion. Recently our world faced various challenges, all caused by the pandemic. Yet the world, in a sense, has become smaller and closer, as our discussion demonstrates today. I think today we have a brilliant opportunity to engage in a joint discussion with our Chatham House partners, local experts, and international scholars. The topic we'll discuss is of immense importance for Central Asia. The new post-COVID world awaits, and we have to have a beacons in our path of development. And I am very much sure that our discussion will establish such beacons and result and tangible recommendations for the future of Central Asia. So I would like to wish all of you to have a productive and constructive discussions today. Good luck and appreciate it for your time. James, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Abachon. Obviously, Central Asia is a region of disparate nations. It always has been, always will be, I'm sure. People tend not to be expert on all 5 countries because of that, actually, in general. One exception to that is Marlène Laruelle, who's expert on so many things, has to be said. I read her work on the Arctic and on Russia. It's quite extraordinary, I have to say. But as I've told you what Marlène is going to speak about today. So Marlène, thank you very much for coming. And over to you in the meantime, please. All yours.
Well, thank you so much, all of you. Thank you for inviting me. I was asked to kind of open the discussion by giving a broad perspective on the immediate impact of the pandemics. And as we have 7 minutes, I will mention 7 issues by 1 minute each. The first one I think that is really interesting to look at is state capacity and preparedness. And of course, as everywhere else, the pandemics is a test on the system of each of these countries, a test obviously on the public health system, but also very interestingly, a test on political communication, on the way the authorities have been managing the discussion with their own society, and also, of course, a test on the capacity to enforce lockdown measures. So this kind of state's capacity preparedness, I think, is a good way to look, the good prisms to look at how the Central Asian states have been reacting. And without any surprise, we had, I think, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan managing pretty well, Kyrgyzstan managing halfway, Tajikistan managing pretty badly, and Turkmenistan being still in denial. So it's a quite good reflection of the general picture, I think, of these 5 states. My second point and notion would be the one of accountability, especially in relation to humanitarian assistance that has been arriving to Central Asia. The European Union has sent a lot of money and equipment, the US, the World Health Organization, several other international organizations. So there are millions of equipment that have been reaching the region. The question is, of course, how is the redistribution going on the ground? These countries have, of course, little accountability, high corruption, and a tradition of state agency smuggling, whatever they have been given by the international community. So here, once again, the crisis is reinforcing a feature that we already know, which is that it's very difficult to function and send assistance in countries where the level of smuggling by state agencies is so high. And so here also we will probably we already have stories coming on how things are managed on the ground. My third point is about the resilience of the societies. And of course, that will be related to the social economic impact of the crisis. And we will be coming back on that after Shayerbek and other will be discussing that. I mean, and for Kazakhstan, of course, combined with the collapse of oil prices. And so it will be difficult here also to measure the resilience of the society, especially because the job markets in the regions are very often informal. But globally, states are relatively poor to have important package of measures that would help the private sector and people to go through the crisis. And so that's interesting to follow both civil society initiatives to try to create network of solidarity to increase the resilience of the society, but also to see the emergence of possibly oligarchs, of local benefactors who want to build their reputation by suddenly acting and organizing some kind of charity action in the region, helping some social groups to increase their resilience. Fourth point is, of course, inequality. As in the Western countries, the crisis is particularly strong on those who are already the weakest, the poorest, the most in difficulties. We have both social, economic, and geographical pocket of poverty all over Central Asia. And clearly the crisis is, of course, hitting them harder than the richer region and social groups. And as you know, for Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan in particular, we have already huge issues of malnutrition in rural region, and clearly there will be food safety issues in the forthcoming months for several of the groups, especially in these 2 states, but more globally for the rural population. Fifth point about migration. As you know, tens of thousands of labor migrants blocked in Russia. Here also, it's not specific to Central Asia. Many people who were not at home when the crisis happened have been blocked in a foreign country. but the Central Asian states are either too poor or not interested in trying to send planes and take their people back home. The Russian authorities are not very generous in taking care of the migrant. And so what we have been noticing, of course, is also a decrease of remittances sent to the region, and even some reverse flows of money going from Central Asia to Russia. So probably families helping their migrant blocked in Russia. So all that is, of course, showing the degree of reliance on Russia, which is a weakness, but it's both a carrier of wealth and a weakness. But it's also show how much Central Asia is globalized, right? And when the world connectivity stopped, then the region is very much affected because precisely it's globalized through its migrant. 6 points about the cooperation and integration issue. The Eurasian Economic Union has totally stopped working with Russia closing its border, even with Belarus. Here also, interestingly, nothing specific if you think about how European states have been closing their border without any coordination between themselves and with the European Union institution. But I think it's sending for everybody a signal that national interests matter the most, and that regional integration is work well when everything is good, but when things are bad, then every state is back to its own national border and managing its own crisis and not really cooperating with others. So here also a signal that maybe will have some impact on the way, on the long term, on the medium term, on the way people perceive the Eurasian Economic Union. And my last point is about the society compliance to lockdown measures. And here also, I think we have really interesting elements to study. Here also, nothing specific if you think on how it's difficult even for European countries to enforce lockdown measures. But if you think about a lot of social issues that Central Asian had to face and had to navigate the lockdown measure, like for example, attending funerals, going to mosque, managing the end of the Ramadan in lockdown situation, soon pilgrimage to Mecca planned for late of July. So you have a lot of, let's say, cultural elements that make that the level of compliance to lockdown measure is kind of challenged, and people have to adapt and be innovative and inventive on the way they can manage what they consider important in their everyday life in terms of societal solidarity and family connection and the lockdown measures. So that was my brief 7 points, and I think I'm more or less on the 7 minutes, and I will stop there and let the others continue. Thank you.
You're absolutely right on the money with the 7 minutes, but that was a super tour de région, Marlène. Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate that. Erica, you've been no less prolific in the last few weeks and months, so it's terrific to hear from you. Over to you, if I may, with no further ado. There'll be plenty of questions. I've got plenty for Marlène already. So has Abacon, I can see that. But we'll just go through the speakers first, I think.
Of course, thank you for having me today, and I hope everyone is doing well wherever you are. So I'd like to build on Marlène's points. She really did an excellent job outlining the broad picture, and I'd like to emphasize that the divide between governments poor governance on the one hand and suffering in the society is really widening. And Central Asia does not really have anything new to offer in its analysis, you know, in the analysis in general, in a comparative perspective, because we see this, the trends we see in Central Asia, we see all around the world in developing or developed countries. But some of the negative features of these developments have been that governments are unable to provide sufficient information to the society or honest information to the society, unable or unwilling, and also unable to deal with economic fall down of the lockdown of the economy, so stopping of economies. That's on the one hand. So poor governance, and then on the other hand, of course, expanding poverty and extreme poverty in pockets of Central Asia that and exacerbated by the slowing down of migration and slowing down in remittances. So and the impact is going to be felt, the economic impact is going to be felt for the years to come. Populations all across Central Asia won't be able to find enough jobs, and we will still are to see what kind of migration dynamics will take place after the pandemic slows down as well. So, but one thing that I am specifically worried in the context of Central Asia is the intensity of autocratic politics accelerating amid the pandemic, especially in countries that are undergoing some elements of political transformation or transition. So Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan in particular, they're all facing uncertain political developments. So in Kazakhstan, who will be the next leader of the country? Kyrgyzstan is going to hold parliamentary elections this year. And in Tajikistan, the president is grooming his son to become the next president. And it looks like that the governments are using the pandemic to expand control over society and over political opponents. We know that in Kyrgyzstan, the parliament is currently considering passing a law that would limit the work of NGOs, and the law is 95% plagiarized from a prototype in Russia. In Kazakhstan, the government is moving to control political mobilization and protests that we've seen, the type of protests that we've seen before the pandemic. And in Tajikistan, of course, there is a more violent rhetoric against political opposition, Kabiri, especially the leader of the Islamic Renaissance Party. This is not helpful in dealing with pandemic because, of course, expanding economic grievances in the population will lead to spontaneous mobilization, will lead to civic activism. And what the governments are doing, they're cutting communication and trying to marginalize civic voices and voices from the society in the public space. And this is a very dangerous mix. We know that, especially from Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan's experience, that without governments responding to quote unquote street politics or mobilization in urban and rural areas, this kind of protest dynamics tends to escalate. We've seen spontaneous protests now taking place in Tajikistan, something that's both rare and unexpected. We've seen how in Kazakhstan, the activists feel even more pressure in the pandemic. And going forward, I think it's a really dangerous mix for radicalization of politics in Central Asia and for greater clashes between civil society activists or just regular citizens and law enforcement, or even armed forces in some cases, specifically in Tajikistan. So this is very dangerous. And I think having this divide and having economic grievances expand in the society also makes societies vulnerable to disinformation, to becoming victims of fake news that can also lead to uncontrollable mobilization or unexpected mobilization against a variety of issues. It can be something at the border, in rural areas, or in urban areas, specifically in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. And then finally, I'd like to also mention that with economy breaking down and more and more people feeling the lack of economic opportunities, I think more people will be vulnerable to exploitation, they may become victims of organized crime, of human smuggling, of various various criminal activities that we already see in Central Asia, be that drug trafficking, human trafficking, human smuggling, extortion, and so on. So these are the bigger trends. I do want to finish my presentation by saying that just like in rest of the world, we also see resilience in the society and mobilization of charity networks, of helplines, and we do see some of the positive mobilization in the society. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So many issues there, including the one about the dangerous risk of increased radicalism. It will definitely come up, I think, in the discussion. Sherbek, over to you. You seem to have picked all the Ds: debt, dependence, and democracy. I don't know if that was on purpose, but go for it, please.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see over 100 persons while sitting still in my office. Some benefits of the current conditions. To start with, I think one thing that we can say for certain is that the implications of the COVID for Central Asia, in this discussion, the only certain thing is that we may have more questions than answers. So whatever issues I would bring up and others will be bringing up, I think these are preliminary and tentative. First, because the virus is still spreading and Central Asian statistics unreliable on their own and in general in the world, but still they show no sign of where the peak may be. If you look at Tajikistan's, the last week, I think, one day you have 200 new cases, then 0, then 400. There's no way to judge about the pattern and trends. So in that sense, statistics being meaningless in general on this COVID, we're still somewhere and we don't know at which stage we are. But since we have about 6 minutes or 7 minutes, I would like to mention several things. And for some reason, they all start with D. Indeed, I would mention debt and dependence and democracy. And probably I would even add disparity as one sentence. And in general, the whole COVID thing is a disaster. So, but we know that disaster is a very generic term, and for some people, disaster is an opportunity. So we may need to go a bit detailed. The first thing is the disparity among Central Asian states, which already was mentioned, I think, by both Eric and Marlene. We have to acknowledge that the Central Asian countries, whenever we discuss Central Asia as a region, we have to acknowledge that these are different countries, and over time, they're becoming even more different. And COVID will probably expose and also augment this disparity, particularly in terms of the trade balance. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are heavily import-dependent countries. The imports 3 times are more than the exports, and that statistics doesn't hold for Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. So these 2 countries heavily dependent, and if the COVID will bring to greater protectionism in international trade, these 2 will suffer, and I think already suffering very much. And second, of course, remittances. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan have been in the top 5 of the world in terms of the dependence on remittances for past 10 years or so. Nothing to be proud about, but still we are the leaders there. And this COVID crisis happened to be the type of crisis that hit there very much. Previous crisis, somehow we didn't even feel, and actually remittances helped to cover up the big problem of non-existence of local economies. And now the problem in Russia and Kazakhstan, the host countries for remittances, will not cover up, but actually expose the degree to which these countries lack self-sustainable local economies to run on. So that's the disparity thing. And second, the general kind of deepening dependence of Central Asian countries on external actors. And here probably I will be speaking more about Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, the second half of the region. One issue is the deepening debt issue. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, again, are among the very few countries in the world that have basically we're on the verge of the upper ceiling of the external debt to GDP ratio. We are heavily indebted, basically, and particularly given the fact that about half of our debts are owned by China. The repayment of debts is very much dependent on how good your economy is. So we've been borrowing with the hope that the economy will grow and will be able to repay. And now the COVID means that the local business is basically sitting at home, businessmen, remittances, the free money coming from Russia is dropping. Tax revenues of the government are dropping. So there are all conditions that we will be having problems with repaying, plus we will be needing to borrow more and more to actually support the budget, which we are doing now. We're going to IMF, to European banks, Asian Bank, everywhere. We started it early, to the credit of Kyrgyz government, but that's nothing to be happy about again. And second, on the dependence issue, I think the one interesting dynamic will be to watch the Russia-China dichotomy. These two countries that are basically hold lots of cards for Central Asia. The Russian economy will be a huge variable. If it, for some reason, picks up fast, then the migrants will kind of stop being a big problem for us. Remittances will probably keep going on. But again, we have here China. China probably is the #1 country which will recover earlier, and it's been already been a huge source of economic or free capital for Central Asian states. And even I think today in the Radio Liberty, there was a news article saying that maybe China is now becoming even more than, it's already a hard power in Central Asia. And so that division of labor that we used to talk about when we discuss Russia and China, that probably already doesn't hold true very much. So COVID will probably lead to even augmenting of that problem. And then finally, Erika already mentioned quite well on the democracy issue. Indeed, I think in Kyrgyzstan, in Central Asia, we see that the COVID livened up this debate about big state versus small state, which in Bishkek, basically, mostly it's about whether authoritarian states are being more successful than democratic states in covering, in addressing this COVID issue. I don't think there's a predetermined way in which COVID will affect the democracy issue. In general, you know that, you perfectly know, democracy is becoming a very unpopular and exotic term in Central Asia in the past several years. But Kyrgyzstan evidence suggests that indeed the two main pressures for democratization, which are pressure from below and pressure from outside, are both weakening. And the COVID is basically helping those things to just further. So I suspect that the vocabulary and even values of the liberal democracy will further weaken, but not necessarily at the expense of creation of strong authoritarian state. Most likely, the civil society will increasingly feature illiberal, nationalist, chauvinist kind of groups who will hold government accountable, but not in the ways that we would like to see. I guess I may be hitting my time, so I'll finish here, and I'll be happy to continue on this in the questions and answers. Thank you.
Vivek, thank you very much indeed for some very original points there. And I note the slightly pessimistic note you end on, because many people think that civil society can be a savior in this aspect. Obviously, there's a lot of work for IWPR, but you're saying it'll actually bring up some of the nastier, more illiberal voices. So that's a fascinating point to end on. So finally, Iskander, please, as we always sort of end on the foreign policy dimensions. I know you want to concentrate particularly on soft power. Over to you, please, sir.
Thank you very much. I would like to certainly start from the kind of geopolitical implications of COVID-19. The year 2020 started as an ideal storm, starting from the Iranian conflict and the killing of General Soleimani. Then we have OPEC scandal or tensions inside of OPEC and the fall of oil prices. And after that, we have a COVID-19 and the spread and a sense of unpredictability around the world. So in the later terms, we see that the negotiation between China and US are becoming more quite difficult. And in the last terms, we saw that US had actually withdrawn from the Open Skies Treaty with Russia. We have arms control treaty, which is ending on the 5th of February last year or next year. And US government is telling that China should be part of that treaty as well. So COVID-19 became kind of the new dimension of old traditional geopolitics, and the sense of unpredictability, and pushing us towards some kind of new reality, how to operate within the online format. The G20, G7 meetings are operating early in online format, and in traditional term, diplomacy is also passing through its transformation. So-called Zoom diplomacy is a new term, actually bringing us to a new reality. And in every negotiation, when you speak online, you cannot kind of transmit your own ideas. There is no emotion, no handshakes. So it brings a kind of sense of something as a hidden agenda. So in this respect, if you talk about geopolitical aspect of COVID, Central Asian states, some of them in most cases are part of the kind of broad integration unions like Eurasian Economic Union, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Belt and Road Initiative, where all Central Asian states are part of. So in this respect, it's very challenging how those integrational mechanisms are going to play out within the economic slowdown and the global lockdown. So in this respect, I believe COVID-19 is going to be not change the whole reality, but certainly accelerate the global process. And we need to think about how we are going to adjust this reality. Recently, President Tokayev actually was taking part in the Eurasian Economic Union meeting of heads of states, where he actually a little bit criticized the proposed strategy. And there was a big outcry from the different sides. And recently we have had a yesterday we had a meeting with Valdai Club discussing specifically Eurasian Economic Union and how we're going to progress in that direction. So we see that from the different sides, there are different questions how Eurasian Economic Union is going to play out. Rightly mentioned that the remittance from other Central Asian countries, from Russia, for example, is another question, because some countries are really dependent on that. And with the lockdown, how we're going to play out. Speaking about specifically China-US relations, this is a very big issue, and this competition brings a sort of unpredictability. I cannot say that it's going to be a Cold War in the old sphere, but the elements of Cold War are going to have economic, technological, and the soft power elements. And there is a great debate whether, in case the stakes are going to be high between two countries, whether they're going to be put into this kind of dichotomy. Are we going to choose US or collective West, or are we going to choose kind of Eurasian side within this respect? So COVID-19 accelerates the global process and brings unpredictability. So we need to adjust to that. Speaking specifically about soft power element, we saw that China tried to kind of play out this pandemic and criticism for their own benefit. So so-called mask diplomacy, where China was sending, by the end of March 31st, China has sent kind of millions of masks to 120 countries and 4 global institutions. So there is another element so-called as Health Silk Road, where China has also started cooperating with Central Asian states on the health and medical sphere. So this is going to be a really interesting element of Belt and Road Initiative, and whether China is going to put forward this dimension, because there is a talk whether with the economic slowdown, whether China is going to promote this initiative in the Central Asia or around the world. So this is kind of very interesting point to make. In terms of the soft power, some Central Asian countries try to use this element, like Uzbekistan assisting Tajikistan, or Kazakhstan sending the masks to Kyrgyzstan, etc. So this kind of state-to-state diplomacy is still there. There is a question why Russia didn't help Central Asian states in terms of the medical sphere, rather that it chose to assist Italy, for example. So speaking with the Russian experts, they usually say that Central Asian state didn't suffer as much as Italy, for example. That's why we try to assist them in this respect. So the global pandemic is a kind of a black swan that emerged in the beginning of this year, and ability to learn how to work on that issue is going to take time. And I believe that during this year, we still have a year to sort out this problem. And this unpredictable situation and unknown future is going to certainly put pressure on the governments. Speaking about specifically Kazakhstan, it certainly showed that some kind of weak points of the government institutions, because they didn't know how to operate and integrate their services on the online format. But it's important to say that there was some positive elements from the government side, for example, specifically Kazakhstan, where it provided like $2.5 billion, specifically assisting 700,000 companies and entrepreneurs, and providing some kind of $100 for like each month for people who actually were limited in terms of the income. But I can disagree with Erika, for example, specifically on the political side of the COVID-19 and how it affects Central Asian governments. Certainly there are some elements where the mobilization of people and the emergency situation can kind of be very attractive to the leaders of Central Asia to prolong that and to work in that dimension, to kind of mobilize people and limit their freedoms. But speaking in terms of the Kazakhstan, we recently had the National Council of Public Trust, where some packages of political freedoms were actually passed through the parliament, specifically on the peaceful assemblies, the parliamentary opposition, the quota for 30% for young and women in terms of the gender and age equality. So there are some elements where governments are trying to kind of push forward the political agenda, but at the same time, I acknowledge the fact that we're not certainly ready to face the pandemic in a full capacity. So in this respect, capacity building is another point that I will agree with Professor Marlene Laruelle, that our governments need to learn how to work in the dimension, because I believe that the pandemic COVID-19 is going to last during this year until the time we find a vaccine, and then we need to spread it to the other countries. Then there is a competition of which country is going to kind of issue the vaccine and how to work in this dimension. So the global competition on between China and Russia, China and US is going to be there for a long time, and the COVID-19 only will add up the fuel to that competition, and we need to learn how to sort these problems out. And maybe for Central Asian countries, this pandemic can be a sort of the challenge that we acknowledge. But at the same time, speaking about the oil resource and oil-oriented countries like Kazakhstan, it can be beneficial in terms of to find out new resources like human capital, to find out new economic development strategies, because we cannot count on oil with this low oil prices. We cannot live in the same way how we lived before. So in this respect, I believe that COVID-19 can bring up a positive development, but certainly it will depend on the civil society, political will, and the general public understanding to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iskander. And whilst I agree with all of your broad geopolitical points there, one of the things that most intrigued me in what you said was a tantalizing thing where you mentioned there was a Valdai discussion yesterday in which I wanted to discuss the Eurasian Economic Union. So if I have time, or if you have time and you can weave it into subsequent responses, I'd very much like to know what the Russians were proposing as far as the EU is concerned. Having said that, I don't really want to speak myself. I think I better get into the discussion. We've got 15 minutes left. I will start with a question from my co-chair, from Abakon Sultanazarov, the Regional Director for Central Asia for IWPR. Abakon, here's your question. A renewed spirit of regionalism was emerging in Central Asia, manifested most overtly in the Summit of Central Asian Leaders in Astana in 2018 and in Tashkent in 2019. So the question, which is asked to Marlene, but really anyone can do this, but we'll go to Marlene first, is will COVID-19 facilitate or hinder, because of the economic crisis, regional cooperation in Central Asia? Marlene,
yeah,
please.
that's a good point. I'm not sure we know for the moment. Of course, the hope would be that it would help developing the regional cooperation. At the same time, the trend we are seeing all over the world is that regional institutions have been kind of shaken by the crisis. I mean, if we look at the way the EU had difficulties responding, at least at the beginning, I think that doesn't send the right signal on the sense that regional or kind of supranational institution can help. Because when you have this kind of crisis, it's usually the more the authorities are local, the more they take the decision immediately. So it's really like state and then region and then municipal authorities. But I think what will really matter in terms of regional cooperation, it's maybe more what Iskander was mentioning, is that how the relationship with Russia and China and the relationship between Russia and China will evolve, that could kind of impact the way Central Asian leaders see the need to really increase their regional cooperation. I'm not sure that the pandemic itself will really kind of foster them to work together, because they can be on a competitive, they are, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan are competing for sending their migrants. I mean, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan have more complementarity, but it's still difficult. So my impression is that if regional cooperation increases, it will be because the relationship to Russia and China will be changing more than because of the direct pandemic effect on the region.
Thank you very much, Marlene. Actually, that does lead me into the question I just sort of hoped to ask you, Iskander. Could you elaborate on since Marlene referenced you, and I was curious about your Valdai meeting yesterday, and the EU is supposed to be about regional cooperation. I suspect it has different motives. Then perhaps you could just take that one on for a second.
Well, there are certainly kind of questions from the Russian side, whether we're going to, what is our position specifically on the Eurasian Economic Union, specifically after the President Tokayev's statements on that regard. Well, speaking frankly, we had, within the Eurasian Economic Union, we had some discrepancies and differences on how we see and how we perceive Eurasian Economic Union. Kazakhstan perceives this union as solely and only as an economic union, where Russians, stemming from their own proposals on the common shared kind of parliament, currency, it has some political elements as well. Belarus has its own dimension. So Kyrgyzstan and Armenia, kind of, they might have their own agenda in this respect. So specifically Kazakhstan, we try to kind of diminish the political element because it's not, we're still, it's a raw organization. It's only how many, 5 years old, and we cannot speak about some kind of really serious integration moments. And President Putin actually, he said himself during another meetings in Russia that we still needed time to kind of develop and discuss that. Because Kazakhstan is going to be a chairman soon in the Eurasian Economic Union, the strategy until 2025, which was not adopted and ratified, wasn't accepted because in this kind of unpredictable situation during the pandemic and this kind of online format, we cannot kind of take this responsibility of taking a new strategy in this very challenging times, because when we're going to become the chairman of Eurasian Economic Union, we need to kind of sort these problems that we kind of created this time. So in this respect, Eurasian Economic Union is a kind of still in the process of making. As Chinese said, that Belt and Road Initiative is only 7 years child. That's why we cannot expect much from that. Certainly there are mistakes, but we need still have a time. We shouldn't rush the process. From the Russian side, they didn't speak much.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, on a related note then, just to keep you there for 1 second, Iskander, before I do bring everyone else in and go on to other matters, and then people talk about the possibilities for cooperation between, or increased cooperation between China and Russia. But Dr. Pravesh Kumar has also just written to me, and it was exactly the same question I was going to ask, is surely it makes more, it seems to me more logical that if you consider that China and Russia were diverging in so many ways, it will actually increase the competition between them rather than the cooperation between them.
Well, we wrote an article 2016 specifically with my colleague Daniel, whom you might know. We specifically wrote about the bargain between China and Russia for Central Asia. And as Shairbek rightly mentioned, this kind of concept of division of labor is not well received in Central Asia and is not well received in China as well, because the Chinese way of operating is certainly on the public level, it's multilateral. We need to cooperate and we need to cooperate. On the de facto, on the practical level, it's bilateral cooperation. And for them, limiting themselves to specifically to economic side is limiting their political moves in the future. And certainly they will need to protect their investments and protect their own kind of strategic vision to the region. But we need to acknowledge the fact that 90% of Chinese trade is being done in the sea, in the maritime Silk Road. And the biggest issues they are facing now is in the South China Sea and in another direction rather than Central Asia. And we need to understand that maybe the competition is not so high between Russia and China in Central Asia. It's just what we would like to see, that to making Central Asia central in the eyes of others. But speaking frankly, we're not so much very interesting in the eyes of the kind of Western powers and the Chinese and the Russian. For them, the biggest competition is going to be in the sea. And that's why it's going to be the biggest problem.
Good point. Well, much appreciated. Thanks for elaborating on that. Before I move on to a Turkmenistan question, actually, then can I just ask Erika sorry, could I just ask Erika or Sherbek if they've got anything to add on regional cooperation?
I agree with everything that has been said. COVID is, there are lots of unknowns, but one thing I want to add is, I think just like in domestic setting, in domestic context, that the pandemic is expanding economic divisions. I think regionally we'll also see some countries recovering much faster, and others, like especially Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, really taking more time to recover because of also dependence on migrant remittances. And this further, asymmetry in economic development may slow down economic integration, regional integration and regional cooperation, with states like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan really becoming even more economically and thus also politically influential in the region.
Thanks. Sherbek, anything to add?
Not much to add, but I can only stress that probably we don't have to try too hard to see the COVID impact on everything. The Central Asian regional integration has been half dead throughout all the 30 years. This was little ups and downs here and there. But if you look at the Kyrgyz-Tajik border issues developing in the past couple of years, and the developments last week, I think, was again shooting and mutual accusation, there is no single sign that we have desire on various sides to speak more, to speak better and more constructively. So I wouldn't exaggerate the COVID implication, but at least as of now, there is no sign that the COVID will push towards greater cooperation.
That's a really good point. Thank you. I think you're absolutely right. Sometimes we sort of maybe even we do slightly over-egg the COVID pudding, and there are other issues out there, and maybe COVID is a massive new factor, but at the end of the day, some of the pre-existing problems are still there. Thank you. Now, I warned you, we haven't really looked at a lot of, we're going to focus on Turkmenistan. It didn't really come up in the presentations. I've got a couple of questions. I'll try and weave them together, but Alex Folks, a long-time election observation official with the OSCE and ODIHR, has asked, looking at particular Turkmenistan, we've seen food shortages, he says, caused by the decision to close the border with Iran, huge impact on the economy caused by the oil price crash, etc., etc. With the country seemingly in a very weak state due to the large impact of COVID-19, what do the panel feel is the long-term future of the country? Is there a risk of it becoming a focus of a power struggle between outside powers? China is seeking to increase its regional influence as well as access to oil and gas, and to Iran with networks of influence in Turkey, etc. So all clashing with Russia, sort of seeking to preserve its historic buffer zone. And yeah, do we need to consider what's going to happen to Turkmenistan, considering it's sort of, I suppose, more on the North Korea side than the Norway side of countries. And it's been one of the, I think as Marlene Laroyelle put it in a previous article, it's been one of the outright deniers of any impact of corona, any evidence of coronavirus. So what will happen to this most unusual of countries? I don't know where to go first particularly, but maybe Marlene, as I just referenced you, it might be best to go to you first, Marlene.
Yeah, well, I think it's really difficult to know how things are developing in Turkmenistan, because we are lacking, really just globally lacking even more information than for the other countries. But as it was said just before by Sherbek, I wouldn't put too much emphasis on the COVID-19 crisis per se. I think they are just kind of long-term trends that are happening now in Turkmenistan. So the difficult oil and gas prices, the relationship with China, the difficult relationship with both Iran and Russia, that make that slowly the way the regime was used to function is kind of getting challenged. And we can see, I mean, difficult to say, we know that they are kind of, there is a rising migration. There are more and more young people trying to leave Turkmenistan. I think on that we have some data because we can see the number of, for example, Turkmen students trying to leave the country to study abroad. So we can see the regime is losing what was making it functional for several years. And then the COVID-19 will just be one more layer in the crisis, but I'm not sure it will be the layer that will make the system change. But clearly, the trends are going in a very difficult direction economically.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anybody else wish to come in on Turkmenistan in particular? As Marlene says, it is the country we simply have the least information about. They've closed off so much, so it's maybe hard to say anything with which is of any use. I don't know if Erica or Sherbek, anybody, Iskander, wants to come in on that. It's fine. I can happily move on. It's a tough one. Okay, I am going to go to a raised hand, actually, if I can find it. It's Baliha Sangera. We will unmute you, please, and you can not listen to me for a change. I'll be most welcome. Baliha, we're unmuting you.
Hi,
yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, and thank you for the really interesting presentation by the panel. China has come up several times. And in relation to debt, the argument here is that because some of the countries are indebted to China, there should be some sort of stop in their payments, some sort of debt cancellation. Well, not debt cancellation, but some sort of delay in the debt to China. Whilst I can understand this argument, would this not also apply to private lenders as well? To banks, so to more commercial. So should we not also be applying this kind of same principle about delaying debt payments, not only to external global powers like China, but also, especially as a lot of the panelists have said, the people that have been most affected are the vulnerable people who have taken out microfinance loans, very vulnerable. They depend on remittances, perhaps, to pay for the repayments. So should there not be some sort of a strategic strategy by the Central Asian countries to ask the commercial lenders to stop asking for repayments? Okay. Thank you.
Baliha, thank you very much indeed. I appreciate that. But I'm going to marry it with a question from Miras Yerimbeyev. It's very related. He says that 2 of the Central Asian countries are members of the Eurasian Economic Union. 2 more are involved in a Eurasian project by having some Eurasian Development Bank projects. Will COVID stimulate Central Asian countries' interests to Eurasian economic integration? Is that possible? Is that possible over time? So, Sherbek, over to you. I think it's mostly for you, perhaps.
Well, on Balihar's question. Hello, Baliha, great to see you, finally, for so many years, during COVID. On the issue of private lenders, really for Kyrgyzstan and perhaps for Tajikistan, but I don't know very much. For Kyrgyzstan, it's been a big issue of those who work on live on this kind of small credits, short-term credits, and suddenly their businesses just shut down or at least blocked for some time. I don't think that, the issue is clear and big, but I don't think the government has capacity and resources to do anything meaningful for them. So except China and except the private lenders, there's also government with its taxation. What I hear from my colleagues working in the tax agencies in Kyrgyzstan is that the government is really stuck on that. Rhetorically, they say that, okay, we can prolong the period when you can pay, you just postpone your payments of taxes. We can't just forgive it. At the same time, the tax inspectors are receiving clear orders that generate money whatever way you can. So I just the other day, I've been speaking to someone working in the tax. So the government itself has not been able to relieve people of taxes. So I'm not sure it has any resources to ensure some strategy with private lenders, be it microfinance corporations or banks. So, but compared to China, of course, that's a very day-to-day problem, covering touching the lots of vulnerable people, small businesses in Bishkek in particular. But I don't think we have any strategies. So that's why I say that we have lots of questions and we are just living day by day. We'll see how it goes. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Interesting answer. Complex question. Now I'm going to shift the topic slightly. Tony Borden has reminded me that perhaps we've slightly played down the medical and humanitarian crisis here. And I think if I sum up his question, it's what happens if this gets worse. We've seen in Russia, again, denial followed by a spiraling of a crisis, and it just gets worse and worse. Belarus as well. And maybe this is going to be true for Central Asia. Maybe it's simply behind the curve, if you like. So what are the prospects if we see a spiraling of infection and deaths for these countries? What would the humanitarian situation look like then if this simply gets worse and worse and they're let's say 2 months behind the UK or Italy in this respect? And would it change the political dynamic or undermine any of the strong Central Asian governments of the region? So the basic question is what if this spirals to an even worse level than it has done before? Maybe Erica, please, perhaps.
This is a very important question, of course, the humanitarian cost of the pandemic in Central Asia. So to begin with, I think all across Central Asia, to a larger extent in Tajikistan, the society generally can't really trust government data on the real picture inside their countries. There has been, of course, just like in many other countries in the world, there has been a huge toll on the medical workers. And there has been also this typical reaction by the government to shut down any complaints, suppress any complaints from the medical personnel about the conditions in which they work. And we've seen this throughout the region, in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, of course, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. I think we will continue to be in this picture of lack of transparency all across Central Asia, not really knowing the real toll. The estimates will vary about how many people really died or how many people are infected. But now that we see some governments reopening, so in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan reopening cities, we really see people are trying to jumpstart the economy, trying to survive somehow. And unfortunately, yeah, the risk of the virus staying is very high. One of the concerns in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan has been that migrants who are returning from Russia, who are able to return from Russia, are bringing new cases of COVID, and it's very hard to quarantine them or to make sure that the quarantine is enforced. And yeah, so it feels like although the initial lockdown was effective in really preventing the bigger catastrophe, I think there will be continuing, steady spread of the pandemic, and maybe the governments will have to resort to lockdown measures again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Erica. Anybody else on these gloomy predictions of if this spirals, please? Marlene, perhaps?
Yeah, no, I agree with Erica, and I think one of the difficulties is that lockdown is a decision that works mostly for rich people in which country and which social economic groups, right? When you are poor, the point is your social economic survival more than your health, right? And so I think, as Erica was saying, is that people really care now to try to see how they can survive economically, and the health issues is almost secondary until the moment they can be themselves infected. So I think the first lockdown worked pretty well. The second one will be much more difficult to kind of enforce, just because the economic heart the economic hitting point has already been made, and people are really now in a dire social economic situation. So as everywhere, a second wave would be really difficult to manage because the societies are not ready for, I think, a second lockdown.
Understood. Thank you very much indeed. Anybody else there? Scherbek, perhaps, on a gloomier picture, by all means?
Well, yeah.
No obligation.
All of the topics that we discussed really were all about, less about the health and the virus itself, but all about the government measures, right? The quarantine, the economic implications. Indeed, most likely the situation will get worse because Kyrgyzstan in particular started the quarantine very early on to the credit of the government, but now there's no resources in the government to continue with that. And I think if the virus goes spread further, most likely we'll have to just accept that, and the pressure on the hospitals will most likely grow in case things get out of control. So it's hard to predict. I don't know how many more migrants will come from Orenburg or St. Petersburg. Whenever we have buses coming, bunches of people are being tested positive. So that's going to be an issue, and I don't think government wants to think about it, but they know that this will be a disaster for them again.
Thanks, Scherbek. Erica, I'm going to come back to you with an extremism question again, because I think it's something you mentioned, and Martin Sokolov's asked a question. But in the meantime, that's just a word of warning to prepare yourself. But Kati, I'm going to go on. So I'm going to look at economics and business for a second. So it's possibly to Scherbek and Marlene, I suppose. Kartika Angriani, I may have pronounced that wrong. I am sorry if I have. She asks, do you know if any of the Central Asian countries have developed a kind of national plan to coordinate diverse actions or activities to support their citizens and businesses? We know that the economic crisis brought by COVID-19 might impact local economies for years to come, but do governments think of a more coordinated approach by having a sort of a national plan or a national strategy? Scherbek, I presume, for starters.
Well, I don't really know for all Central Asian states. In Kyrgyzstan, the government is coming up with some documents saying this anti-crisis plan. I don't even know how it's called, but that's certainly not what probably the question means. This is a very short-term planning of how we are going to relieve local businesses and so on and so on. At the moment, there's not much of planning because Kyrgyzstan, unlike other countries, doesn't have much resources to spread. So we all depend on how much money we generate by talking to IMF, Islamic Bank, EBRD, Asian Development Bank, and so on. So any plan will depend on what resources you accumulate. So on paper, we may have some documents, and the government is certainly reporting that they're developing anti-crisis plan for second stage, third stage. But to be honest, I think we're still in the middle of the crisis, and they will need more time to reflect, and there's also even government turnaround happening. Most likely Prime Minister in Kyrgyzstan may get sacked in the coming weeks or months, who knows. So not really much of optimism there.
Indeed, got it. Marlene, any national plans you're aware of?
Yeah, well, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are ready to put some money on the table to try to help their businesses. And of course, the point is especially important for Kazakhstan, and I guess Iskander can develop more on that. But of course, as an old country, having been able to put money on the side in a kind of national fund, there is all this discussion, as you can have in other countries, about which kind of money should be withdrawn from this kind of national fund to be put in the economy right now. But I guess Iskander could probably develop more on that than me.
Sure, Iskander, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. As I previously mentioned, that Kazakhstan has taken the early measures. It imposed the emergency and quarantine on 16th of March. And then we moved forward, just limiting the activity on the street, etc. So it hit the economy, and government tried to kind of sustain and provide some assistance to the people, and like 4.5 million people received the kind of $100 assistance each month for 2 months. But I mean, even the number 4.5 million people, it's 1/3 of the population. It means that there are some problems if people are asking for help. So it means that the economy is still kind of is growing up, and IMF has pointed out that the kind of that the Kazakh economy is going to be 2.5% lower than expected. I mean, kind of, or is going to develop in 2.5% GDP. And I think that the governments around the world are going to kind of deviate from GDP growth, like China did during the last plenary session in the parliament, where they told that we're not going to announce our GDP this year as they did before, and which means that the real economy, the structures of economy is going to change. And I agree with Shairbek is that we cannot kind of think about long term, in the long term, in terms of the economy or national plan, because these measures were taken specifically for the first wave of lockdown, the first lockdown. The second lockdown is going to be, as Marlene said, more difficult. And I don't know whether we are going to, how we're going to work in the next year, because traditionally Kazakhstan has this kind of tradition of putting Kazakhstan 2050, Kazakhstan 2030, all these long-term plans. And in this respect, it's very difficult to even plan for 5 years. And that's why the sense of unpredictability and these black swans are going to be around in the air for at least a year.
Thanks, Iskander. I'll just do an outrageous bit of marketing on the back of that, since you mentioned Kazakhstan, but the Chatham House report on Kazakhstan, which you can see on your screens for those who've got it open, was released in Russian just this week. And if you, it's still, for my money, having reread it recently, it still holds, and you can get that off the Chatham House website, and maybe in a few months' time buy a physical copy if we can get back into the office. But I think that because COVID hasn't changed everything and has exacerbated existing trends, no more, no less, then it's still worth a read, even if I do say so myself. Right, Erica, I warned you. Martin Sokolov's question was really asking you to elaborate on your point about the risk of radicalization. I mean, to read it out, he says that, has COVID-19 the capacity, taking into consideration its economic and societal and political impacts, to contribute to violent extremist organizations gaining support even from members of the Central Asian countries? So yeah, I mean, I'm asking, you mentioned it, Erica, but I suppose if I just to elaborate on the question, it would be, I understand that there's a risk of everything right now. All risks are heightened. What's your evidence to suggest that there is a risk of increased fundamentalism? I'm sorry.
So I didn't exactly mean increased religious fundamentalism. This is not what I meant. What I think is already true, and we see signs of it in Central Asia or around the world, is people for the lack of certainty and lack of clear communication from central authorities, national authorities, people resort to all sorts of conspiracy theories about COVID, how it came about, whether it's true or not, what to do against it. And we see that quite a few people, we don't have exact polling, of course, but quite a few people believe in a variety of conspiracy theories. And this lack of information or agreement on basic facts throughout Central Asia provides space for further disinformation, for populist politics, for spread of radical ideas, be they religious, political, ethno-nationalist. It's just this breeding ground and this uncertainty in economic shutdown and fear of own health and own prospects for the future, uncertainty about the prospect for the future. It creates this really fertile ground for the spread of radical ideas in general. They may be religious, but they may also be of a different kind.
Understood. Okay, thank you for that important clarification. Yeah, Iskander. Yeah, please, Iskander first, then Marlene. Yeah,
I can take this specific question on the so-called religious radicalism in terms of if we allow this concept. If you look at the latest statistics and data, for example, what's happening in Middle East, the latest activities of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, there were some loopholes from the government side and from international partners in Syria, for example, where like 40% of the population of Syria is still living not under the government control, and the ISIS activities are still there. And this pandemic, we didn't hear during this pandemic much about the ISIS, we can all agree. And this is a kind of a good opportunity for this kind of radical organization terrorist organization who can kind of regroup, kind of regain their power in some limited terms, but certainly kind of act in different parts of the world. For example, in Afghanistan, some members of ISIS Khorasan actually taken responsibility for killing people and exploding the hospital in Kabul, killing hundreds, many people. So for terrorist organizations, this can be a good opportunity. And I can recommend you to look at the comments and reports made by Peter Newman, who is an expert actually on the terrorism, and he specifically wrote on the COVID-19 and the spread of the terrorist activities in the Middle East and other parts of the world.
Got it. Marlene, please.
Yeah, if I can add on that, I think we should be very careful in making a connection between accentuating poverty and kind of radicalism or terrorism. I think the links is not really there. It's not because you are poor that you will get radicalized. A lot of people who get radicalized religiously, or let's say radicalized in the sense of joining a terrorist organization, are not necessarily the poorest. They can be really part of the middle classes, right? So I would be careful in doing that links. What I think is happening, what Erika was mentioning, is that losing the trust in the state capacity in managing this crisis open also an ideological space to fill out with other things. It can be conspiracy theory. It can be also the notion that Islam would give you a solution, or a political vision of Islam would bring you a solution. So I think if we see anything happening between the current crisis and the relationship to Islam, it will not be on the field of radicalization and terrorism. It will be more like the kind of cultural Islamization of the society as a way to strengthen, to build resilience, new form of network of solidarity, of charity, of giving meaning to things that are happening, but so that more on this kind of cultural Islamization potentially than on anything related to kind of terrorism and violent radicalism.
Very important point. Thank you very much, Marlene. I'm going to switch topics again. This one's about agriculture, possibly therefore for Sherbek. I don't know, sorry. From Asif Oddabayev asks, what do you think about the problem of the agricultural sector in Central Asia? Increase in food prices or lack of food in the region? What can you say about that, please, Sherbek, maybe?
Okay, let me first vary 5 cents on the radicalization topic.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you.
In the past 2-3 years, I have a strong impression that there's a hype over this PVE, there's this vocabulary of donor agencies. And if we can assume that 50% of this attention is driven by the agenda of those who just bring in the money for the research and media, then we can expect that COVID basically is replacing that. So COVID will be the new terrorism, new radical Islamization, the PVE to a great extent will be replaced by COVID. Now all the public attention, all the research, all these conferences like this, I could easily imagine that 3 years ago, this kind of Zoom would be discussing the sources of recruitment of the people to Syria and so on. So the issue, of course, will not be removed, and I completely agree with Erika and Marlene as well as their comments, but this portion of PVE, this preventing violent extremism rhetoric that was driven too much by donor, I think that will be just replaced by COVID. And yes, on agricultural sector, honestly, of course, I don't know much. I'm not an economist, but my sense is that when we speak about Central Asian economies, this has been, even from the Soviet period, particularly for Tajik, Uzbek, and Kyrgyzstan, our assets, our items of exports. If you look at what we export to Russia, other than Chinese products made kind of with the label of made in Kyrgyzstan, those are the agricultural stuff. And in that sense, I think COVID basically revived domestic agriculture. The Eurasian Economic Union has already been pushing that trend, and now people basically eat fruits, go to a pharmacy, and they don't spend money on anything else, right? So, but more in general, in terms of the supply chain, whether some countries will stop exporting grain to others, that's, I think, big issue. So far, we haven't seen much more to the, other than the pandemic of the fear or the anxiety. But in the long term and the bigger scale, I don't know. But so far, I see the existing chunks of agriculture are working hard now. They have good time now.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'll move on. Having said that, I'm a little short of questions, so don't be shy if anybody wants to raise a hand or add more to the chat. So I'll fill in one of my own. It's inspired by something Marlene said right at the very beginning. And it's, Marlene, you mentioned that with respect to sort of reliance on Russia and migration remittances, that the region is quite a globalized region in this respect. It's funny because I don't really think of Central Asia as being particularly globalized, and to be perfectly honest, and I don't mean this as being offensive, but it is perfectly reasonable if you look at Central Asia from a global standpoint of view, if you think of it as a regional backwater. So few people care about it. And so few people have been there, even in an international relations think tank or Center for International Studies, as you and I work in, then I think it just tends to be the ignored part of the world by and large. So I somehow doubt still the globalization of a region. So my question is to you, and probably Iskander again, is how will your prognosis, how does COVID and the region development, how does it affect the globalization of Central Asia, regardless of how globalized you think it is in the first place, if we differ on that? Maybe Marlene and Iskander.
Yeah, I think that you're raising a great point. I think it depends how we want to define globalization and at which level we want to look at. Of course, if you look in terms of, I don't know, infrastructure and regional trade, then Central Asia is not globalized, it's kind of marginalized. If you look at the role of labor migration, the role of remittances, it's a globalized region. It's a region where diaspora really matters because they are the one bringing money home. If you look in terms of offshoring of money strategy, then the Central Asian elites are very much globalized.
Fair
if
enough.
you look and so in a sense, it's China is the big point of globalization in the sense that suddenly the region has been connected to a big country playing a role in trying to globalize the world, or at least the old continent. But I think on many aspects, if you look at the world level, of course, Central Asia is many places that doesn't create a lot of interest. But if you look from the Central Asian societies, people on the ground, I think, also can feel very much globalized in the sense that almost everybody, as member of the families living abroad, every member as every family has people in labor migration, people feel the influence of Russia or China, they feel the influence of the Emirates, for example. So I think there are many kind of more cultural or social economic aspects that we usually don't see that make that Central Asian people, the society themselves, are in fact quite globalized. And I even don't speak about the elites who are totally globalized.
Fair enough. Iskander, please.
I fully agree with Marlene, specifically that living in Central Asia, we don't feel that we are landlocked, for example. Yes, physically, yes, we are landlocked. Yeah, spiritually, intellectually, that we actually would like to visit Europe and other Asian countries. We have flights, etc. So speaking geopolitically, yes, we as a region itself, as a 5 countries, we may not possess this kind of capacity to present ourselves as a kind of a powerhouse as a European Union or other unions, even like ASEAN countries. So we don't have this capacity. We don't have even kind of politically institutionalized union as ASEAN or Nordic Council or other kind of unions. We have kind of informal Central Asian meetings between the leaders. So this is a process in making, and we kind of need to acknowledge our weaknesses. And it's leading to the question, how central is Central Asia? So we would like to see ourselves as a central, and to deviate from the Soviet Middle Asia. So why we can be interesting is because of the strategic closeness and geography to Russia and China. Speaking with the like Western and Japanese or Asian experts, why we are so much can be studied is through because we are linked to the Belt and Road, Eurasian Economic Union. It's kind of big institutions just that include many countries in capacity of China and Russia. That's why we can be interesting. And we still have Afghanistan issue, which is still there. And that's why we have US kind of focus on that. And recently Trump has claimed that we can at any time bring back our soldiers to Afghanistan. And Afghanistan is still there. It's not so far from Central Asia. That's why kind of there is the biggest kind of US interest in Central Asia is mainly Afghanistan. And if you look at the latest US strategy to Central Asia, out of 6 points that US government mentioned, 4 points belong to Afghanistan. So Afghanistan basically the kind of the sole interest of US to this region. And now there is China. And since we are close to China, we can be in the radar of other great powers.
So Charles Garrett has added to my own question on globalization, and he says, do you see the Central Asian states in that case coming into closer relationships with international organizations, encouraging them into greater collaboration within a rules-based international system? So is there any prospect that Central Asia becomes, I don't know if more westernized is the right term, it's really not, but if they do become, we talk about Russia and China all the time, but we haven't been speaking about their relationship with the West or Western-led rules-based international organizations. What about the possibilities there, please?
Well, I can add just a few on that and let the other. I think the Central Asian states are already member of as many world international organizations as they can. It's part of their strategy since the 90s to really become a member of almost everything where it's possible to be a member, because they see that as a strategy also for national prestige, just to be recognized as being part of this international community. So there is a kind of nation branding aspect. And I would be careful in conflating this kind of international system with anything rule-based or Western style. I think it's two different things. Many of the world organizations that are kind of UN-based are voting by majority, right? So it's not really the Western countries that are dominating them on many aspects. The Central Asian states are part of a lot of institutions that are mostly symbolic role and not a lot, but that contribute to the socialization of Central Asian diplomacy. So I think on that, they are already very well internationalized. They know very well how the system functions. They know how they can play the system quite well, trying to get money on different sides, trying to get partnership on different sides. So, and I don't think the West has anything more interesting to offer to the regimes that now that the others can have. I mean, we are expensive, not reliable, and having kind of a political agenda of whatever democratization, rule of law we want to call it, that doesn't fit them. And except the West, there has a lot of other international organizations where you can be a member without any of these issues. So I don't think there is any chance for the West to try to speak to the regimes, at least at that level. Maybe we can speak to the society, but clearly not at the regimes level.
Well, that is a shame. But I see your logic, Malin, yes. Having asked for more questions, I am now a victim of that because I now have far too many and we have 5 minutes to go. But I'm going to just sort of arbitrarily pick one. And actually, it's particularly arbitrary because somebody has already asked a question, but it's a particularly good one. Martin Sokolov has come up with a corker whereby he's asking if the pandemic is impacting the transition of power in Kazakhstan. But I won't just limit it to Kazakhstan and elsewhere. I mean, Martin's talking about the role of Nursultan Nazarbayev and the recent presidential decree to increase the power of President Tokayev, what's happened with Dariga, of course, very recently. And so I suppose the broader question, and Martin's, is will this hasten the departure of any of our dearly beloved Central Asian leaders? And I'll go to everybody there, so because it's the last question, as I say. So let's do it in sort of reverse order, with Iskander first, then Sherbek and Erika, then Malin.
Well, this is last but not the least. I mean, this is an important question, and we are experiencing the kind of the political transition is still there. It's not finished. Yes, on the procedure level, there is a new president, but still kind of the ideas, the measures, the old habits die hard. This kind of approach is still there. Certainly, the COVID-19 and the latest changes within the government apparatus has strengthened President Tokayev's position, and we see that the changes within the personnel and the latest step down of former Speaker of Senate is a showcase of that. But still, there are some kind of rumors from different side whether we're going to see some people coming back to the political scene. So still, there is a room for maneuver, and some people can come back. But I would like to say that transition is happening not only in the government, on the government level. Transition in the mindset of society is still there. I mean, it's also going on. People are changing the kind of attitudes, their perceptions. There are other voices that are coming up, and we see kind of diversification of political opinions, so that they're kind of competing on the different sides. And I believe that the social contract that was established specifically after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where there was a single strong leader, is changing. And now I think we are coming closer to more collective, gradually, I'm saying gradually coming to more collective way of operating the government mechanism, because we will not have as strong leader as former President Nazarbayev, but what we can have is a gradual institutional collective-based approach where there is a president and then there is a strong parliament. So it will have some kind of back and forth ways where we'll have a see mistakes, etc. But it will need to take time, and I think that the biggest role belongs to the civil society itself, because they need to transform as well. I mean, not only the government, and they need to take a kind of bolder and more substantial actions in a constructive way.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Iskander. Sherbek, impact on transitions?
Okay, can I just quickly also touch on the Ambassador Garrett's question about how the crisis, whether it will bring closer to international organizations, particularly this rule-based international system. In Kyrgyzstan, we've been observing that, interestingly, it wasn't China and Russia, but mostly European institutions or international multilateral organizations where we went, asked for money and received. IMF, we almost forgot about IMF for many years since Akayev times. Now we know IMF again with 2 tranches. However, and I think this international community based in Bishkek must be very much, they already know, but they must be aware about, is that this movement is very much forced action, and the latest developments with NGO law suggest that the government isn't really accepting the rule-based international system. It's a very pragmatic move, searching for money, but extra efforts must be made to make sure that this reviving relationship will bring the governments towards closer to the rule-based system. We know that Central Asian governments, including Kyrgyzstan, has been growing increasingly arrogant against this, what we call international, we mean Western rule-based system, with the downgrading of the OSCE, one of the biggest examples. So I think kind of double-edged answer is there. As for the last question about the impact of the crisis on the political dynamics, on the prospects of the incumbents, here, I think the hope of any incumbent would be that the COVID pandemic will generate this rally around the flag impact, so that just like in South Korea, the government won predominant landslides during the COVID. Unfortunately for them, for Kyrgyz, for Central Asian governments possibly, that's not really going to happen, I think, because the government lacks resources, and the government has rather generated negative reactions from the society rather than the positive. So what I expect, and we have parliamentary elections coming up in the autumn, and presidential election is just, presidents have just 1 term. So basically it's also about the test for the next presidential elections. We will most likely see the fragmentation of the political forces. And if the ruling government, ruling party, or there's no ruling party now, but we know who the group is, if they want to prolong their life, prolong their control over the government, they will need to go for greater repressive methods. Otherwise, I don't see the current kind of harmonious relationship between all 5 parties in the parliament to continue as the elections approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherbek. Erica.
Yeah, building on Sherbek's point, it's also uncertain how campaigning will take place. We don't even know who would be the top 5 players in the elections yet in Kyrgyzstan. In regards to Tajikistan, I think the president, for as long as he could, tried to present a picture that everything is all right. You know, so we'll have celebrations. We're going about our life as normal. And I think that's in conjunction with his attempts to establish his son as a successor. So his son is now second in line, and it will be very important for him to preserve the image of, you know, happiness all around in Tajikistan without having to consult with the society that generally depends on migrant remittances and doesn't expect much from the government anyways. So those dynamics will change. And one note on Uzbekistan, I think this pandemic demonstrated that the political transition in Uzbekistan has been completed. And Mirziyoyev has established himself comfortably in power and has already built a robust PR machine, messaging machine inside the country and outside the country, in the region as well, communicating exactly what his government is doing and how he is tackling the pandemic. And that is, of course, helping his popularity as well.
Thanks, Erica. Marlene, you seem to have the last word, actually. And I remember, just to quote your article again, your PONAR's Eurasia article, I think I read it some weeks ago now, but my recollection is that your conclusion was that their survival, their ability to survive, will sort of depend upon their ability to convince the population that they've handled this crisis adequately.
Yeah, I think that the key political points for them, and honestly, it is also for Western states on many aspects, to show that they did the best they could, and the collateral price was kind of unavoidable. But I would like to second what Erica is saying. I think that for Uzbekistan, the management of the crisis is really a kind of a plus on the shoulder of the Mirziyoyev regimes, really showing how they have been able to manage it the best they could, at least in the way they have been presenting it. But clearly in Uzbekistan now, there is really a new regime functioning fully and entirely under Mirziyoyev control. In Kazakhstan, as Iskander was saying, the things are more complicated, and I think we really have to look at how Tokayev will be managing the Nazarbayev family, right? Because that's where you really have a potential political tension. Good things for Mirziyoyev when he arrived in power is that the Karimov family was already out of the political system, and he didn't have to deal with Gulnara. She was already outside a few years before he arrived in power. Now Tokayev has, if he really wants to be able to build this power, will have to deal with the power of the Nazarbayev family, and we have seen one first step in relationship to Dariga. So I think for Kazakhstan, there is still a kind of long step to see how the Tokayev regime will be able to consolidate. And of course, how things evolve in Russia may also have an impact on how the Tokayev regime will be able to kind of consolidate itself.
Thank you very much, Marlene. Absolutely. Well, of course, I'm massively prejudiced, ladies and gentlemen, but that was easily the best discussion on the impacts of COVID on Central Asia development that I've heard in the last 8 weeks or so. So my immense thanks to all the panelists. I was going to give the last word to my co-chair, Abakon Sultanazarov, but in fact, he has asked me if I could give the final closing remarks to the executive director of the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, Tony Bourdain. So Tony, if we could unmute you, please. I don't think you're a co-host. Anna, can you unmute Tony? Then the last few words. But in the meantime, just before you say anything, it's an absolute pleasure to work with you, Tony, and Abakon, and Jamilia as well. Thank you very much. Hope to do it again sometime. And we appreciate you all listening. Chatham House, for its part, will continue to write and speak on these issues. My colleagues Ljubica Polakova and Kate Mallinson have got pieces coming out on the impacts of COVID on the Caucasus and Central Asia in the next couple of weeks. But we will do a lot more of this, I am sure, including with you. Tony, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, James. The main reason for me to intervene is to make sure that we thank the IWPR team adequately enough, as well as Chatham House and all of the speakers. I'd agree that it's just been a fascinating and really intriguing discussion, and it shows that despite our separation, somehow the magic of this technology allows us to come together. And I really think this was not just the best on Central Asia, but on many of the conferences. I'm sure you've been on many, and I feel very much the same way. Fortunately, there needs to be no summary of the discussion, because our excellent teams at IWPR and Chatham House will be posting online. There'll be a report, there'll be a summary. I think there'll even be you can relive the entire experience. So that's fantastic. And I'd certainly would thank Sherbek, Erica, Iskander, and Marlene in particular for their really terrific and precise contributions. I think you complemented each other very well. I have to say, looking at your CVs, it makes me heartsick, because I should be in Kazakhstan. I'm often in Washington. I miss London above all, where I actually reside. The only place I have to admit is I broke lockdown to go to St. Andrews just the other day to pick up my daughter from university. So Sherbek, I was just nearby. But it reminds us of this globalized world that we all ache and miss so much. And I congratulate you for pulling it together so well. I think we see what the experts are telling us is that this hasn't changed things. It's exacerbated the trends. What we don't know is, I don't think it's democracy versus non-democracy society, non-democratic societies that deal with COVID better. It's coherent or cohesive societies versus incoherent ones. You can have a chaotic democracy that can make a mess of it. You can make an incompetent dictatorship that will make a mess of it. An effective dictatorship will do well, and a trust-based, well-functioning democracy can also do well. So this gives to me some lot of granularity and understanding how we may think Central Asia is and can respond. I think we all flagged, thank you for my question, James, that there is what we don't know is something acute is going to happen that changes the dynamic further. It sounds like political stability is really what the governments are trying to maintain. And if a second wave makes things acute, and whether that throws it out of balance is all to see. I mean, from the IWPR perspective, we try to be regionally focused and build bridges. We also try to be focused across the society internally. We think that trust is really the biggest factor, and if civil society can engage, but also if official factors can engage together and across the borders, that's our best hope, and that's certainly what the team does. We're really honored to partner with Chatham House in this, so thank you above all, James. But really, I'm only here because our Central Asian team is also modest, and they would not toot their own horn loud enough. And it's not just Abahan, but our wonderful Central Asian, Kabar Central Asia team that we congratulate. So thank you very much, everybody. What I don't know is whether you're able to lift the global mute lock so that we could congratulate our speakers in one, but whether it's loud or mute, I think we all share lots of thanks and congratulations to everybody who participated and spoke so well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.